Hello to everybody listening to this recording. This is Tom Jakes and Subodh Karnik from the Coalition Greenwich Markets Research Team. What we do in our business is we spend a lot of time talking to liquidity providers on the sell side, institutions on the buy side, and also corporates. And that's what we wanted to spend today talking about. We wanted to share our thoughts on the FX market, how it impacts the corporate market, and what potentially the corporate market could learn from the institutional market. So with me, as I said, I have Subodh. He has many, many years experience in the FX market. I hope I'm not dating him with that.
Thank you, Tom. I do have 22 plus years of experience in the FX markets. So yes, you can date me. I don't mind that.
And on your time with the sell side, you obviously worked with corporates, you worked with institutions. What do you think corporates can learn from institutions?
Thanks, Tom. Yes, so look, I mean, first let me contextualize this discussion, your question. There are any number of corporates that are fantastically sophisticated in these markets and are very, very intelligent and smart about how they approach these markets. Having said that, typically the charge is led on the institutional side in terms of whether it's creating alpha, whether it's electronification, whether it's exploring newer and more sophisticated ways of connecting and executing. So there is an element of truth in saying that maybe there is something the corporate sector as a whole can look at the institutional side and say, hey, what are the best practices there that we can think about adopting on our side? And a few jump to mind right away. One thing you realize when you're on the sell side and dealing in electronic markets, especially in foreign exchange, is the value of information. And it's a bit of a tautology, but if you think about it, the more people know about what you're trying to do, effectively, the more impact it's going to have because people will get ahead of you, if that makes sense. And one issue that I've seen the way a lot of corporates deal is on MDPs with an RFQ going out to 8, 10, 12, sometimes 15 counterparties. Now, I've seen papers that say that the marginal utility of the price improvement that you get from asking a price from multiple counterparties simultaneously starts dropping off pretty quickly after you ask the 5th or 6th counterparty. So all you're doing effectively by spreading that RFQ across a broad range of counterparties, liquidity providers, is you are essentially leaking your information out. And that's actually not helping you. It also hurts the sell side counterparty, the LP, that wins that deal. Because now everybody knows what was happened, and therefore their hedging quality drops. What it effectively does is it probably gets you, on an average, a worse execution experience that you would otherwise, and it definitely destroys or really damages any chance of monetization that may be possible for the LPs. So that's one thing, that rationalizing the number of LPs that participate in the typical RFQ. The other thing that leads me from there then to say that most corporates that I have spoken to do still prefer either voice or MDP. And it's not the most efficient way to think about it because there are other equally efficient or sometimes more efficient modalities available. And I would pick one specific one to talk about. Now, of course, there are corporates that are quite wedded and quite well integrated into certain STPs, and I'm going to leave that aside for now. But the average corporate that's dealing
sorry to interrupt, Subodh. Just to clarify, an SDP is a single dealer platform. That's a bank's front end where you may access it via a browser to execute FX trades.
Exactly. So that's actually pretty optimal and that's good, but that leads to effectively a bilateral tied relationship, and sometimes that's an efficient way to do it. And we'll actually come back to that, and I want to talk about it a little bit more in depth later. But the modality I want to have on the table right now to discuss that is quite well embedded on the institutional side, which I would like more and more corporates to start at least thinking about and looking at, is executing using algos. And one of the reasons is that it's a fairly transparent way of how execution happens. It is a way where you don't necessarily have to risk transfer right away. You can select. There's a wide menu of algos available, some of which are very passive and will wait for the market to come to you, and some of which are quite aggressive and will go through the market for you. But what it does is the current range of algos available are very sophisticated. They're adaptive, so they adapt to market conditions as the market changes around while your execution is going on. And secondly, as I said, they're very transparent. So you get a very clear view of where your execution was done, its comparison to your arrival price, and all kinds of metrics done through what's called TCA, transaction cost analysis. And that's a very common thing on the institutional side to assess the quality of the execution that your liquidity provider gave you through their algos. So I'm quite keen to see corporates start looking at that modality of execution.
Yeah, that's very interesting, Subodh. It's one thing I want to go back to. You talked about RFQ to all, or RFQ to 8 to 10, and that being bad for the market. Now, obviously, as a corporate, you need to think about who you're interacting with. And there'll be many other things. It's arguably, I'd say, more complex than when you're thinking about when an institution is thinking about who they're interacting with. How should a corporate entity go about selecting counterparties to partner with in the FX market?
Absolutely. Now, first off, I do admit that corporates face different compulsions in terms of how they have to interact with the markets. Foreign exchange typically, for the average corporate, for most corporates, is not really, hopefully not an alpha activity. It's usually it's either hedging or it's payments or it's corporate actions or something like that. And so therefore, many times corporates have to tie their foreign exchange activities with the larger set of banks they deal with for their balance sheet work as well as other facilitation. In that case, of course, those counterparties, those LPs get into your FX dealer pool. If you have the flexibility of going beyond that dealer pool, if you have the flexibility to be able to face off against counterparties that don't necessarily have balance sheet work going on with you, then there are some very interesting ways to assess who you should deal with. Increasingly, especially foreign exchange, is so electronic that most large counterparties for corporates will offer solutions that not just cover your immediate execution, but may cover other services. So a good example is there are a few banks that will offer you integrated services that let you execute as well as conduct your payment business through them. Now that's an interesting offering because the less you have to manually intervene in the end-to-end booking chain of a transaction. So what I'm saying is if you're doing an FX transaction because it's part of a payment, and if you then have to manually enter it, the possibility of error essentially increases. The more manual intervention, obviously, the more mistakes that can be made. If it's end-to-end electronified, especially integrated in a single system, that's great. Because then the probability of error drops significantly. And given that FX is, essentially you only have downside, everything done well in FX just means that you got out flat, but a mistake will cost you. That's a good solution. That's a good way to, look at counterparties when you're evaluating them. Of course, price is always, important, but increasingly in foreign exchange market, differentiating on price is getting harder and harder. Everybody shows good pricing. Another one I like to have, on the table when I'm talking to corporates is access. A lot of the multinationals we speak to have very far-flung operations, many times some legs in emerging markets, and a counterparty that can offer you seamless service between DM and EM markets that can integrate your flows, that can net things, that can handle end-to-end transactions across multiple markets is obviously a favored counterparty. And you have multiple large sell-side liquidity providers who can provide that. So there are different ways to think about it and different ways to evaluate your counterparties. But as I said earlier, when we were talking about MDPs and RFQ to multiple counterparties, these are relationships you have to build. These, having come from the sell side, I've seen it. It works best when there's a feeling of partnership. And when the engagement with corporates sometimes gets a little gets the sand in the gear, when there's a feeling that that the sell side bank is looking to extract every last penny of value from the transaction. And I'll say from, I'm not going to talk on behalf of the sell side. I no longer sit on the sell side, but as somebody who's spent his entire or most of his career there, that it's actually quite different. And, the feeling always, for the most part, is about how do you partner with the particular buy side client? How do you partner with the corporate to provide not just the best liquidity, but the best solution? Because ultimately what works with corporates, I found, is providing an end-to-end solution. FX is, not to put a negative spin on it, but a problem. And how do you solve the problem in a way that is most efficient, most cost effective, creates the least number of pain points in terms of errors and exposures, and effectively ends up fulfilling whatever the corporate needs to do from a hedging perspective, from a payment perspective, or a corporate actions perspective, if that makes sense.
I think that makes a lot of sense. The way that I would perhaps summarize this is that it's about managing relationships to ensure you have great integration across products, but also retaining optionality.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And so when people are working with these partners, what should they be asking? What should corporates be thinking about when they're looking to execute their FX flow? What should be involved in those conversations with those liquidity providers?
I think the attitude should always be, and that's you have to set the bar high for your sell side liquidity providers, is the attitude should be one of advisory. It should, I think it's time both sides move away from, what's the price? Show me a tight price, show me the best price. And it's more about what is the solution you're offering me? What is the advice you're giving me? And the advice can range from advisory on liquidity, advisory on, what's the best time to execute. You are a corporate, you need to do a large ticket, for example. Is it worth doing in the next half an hour? How should it be done? If you are a corporate that needs to execute a few €100 million, for example, and it's 20 minutes before payroll, what's the modality? Should you do an algo? Should you do a risk transfer? If you're a corporate that needs to do a large chunk of dollar-yen in New York afternoon, and it's a quiet market, what's the modality of doing that? Should you wait? Should you wait for Tokyo Open? Those are the kind of things that the best liquidity providers provide their top corporate clients, and I think corporate should demand that kind of relationship and that kind of content from their coverage. The other thing to as we touched upon earlier is the overall system connectivity. Do you have a payments module? Can we connect into that? What is the electronic connectivity? How much can we move to the electronic side? What is the price code? What is the pricing and the quality of the pricing on the electronic platform? So all these things effectively factor in how you have to engage with the sell side LPs and how the sell side LPs should engage back with you. And effectively, look, FX is a fairly straightforward product, so to speak, on the Delta One side, and the engagement that the sell side has built with the institutional client set is fairly efficient. And ultimately, that's a good model, as we started the discussion with. That's a good model to port over to the extent it fits on the corporate side too.
Is there any benefit you think that banks and liquidity providers get from having this corporate flow? Is there a particular value to it?
Absolutely, and that's corporates. Many corporates are aware of it, and if they are not, they should be. Typical corporate flow, and it touches upon the reason is something we touched upon earlier, is that for most corporates, FX is not the main line of business, not any line of business. It's essentially to fulfill some kind of service. It's either hedging exposures, payments, or corporate actions, and therefore it is completely non-systematic. It's idiosyncratically non-correlated to the overall markets. The challenge the sell side has, the LPs have when they engage the institutional client set, is that most of the flows, even the flows that are not alpha, the flows that are on the back of real money hedging, are still fairly correlated, because the hedging that real money does is on the back of their activities in the fixed income and equities markets, which again we are a mouse chasing its own tail here. On the other hand, corporate FX flows typically are completely uncorrelated to the market. They are unique, and therefore they create the opportunity to have interesting netting that can happen, internalization that can happen for the sell side. And it also lets them have flows that don't necessarily hurt them when they go to hedge. That obviously is negated when you send out an RFQ to 12 that benefit is lost, and that benefit, therefore, that cannot be passed back to the corporate because the sell side then actually doesn't get that benefit.
Yeah, and certainly I think another aspect of that is if you spread your business too thinly, you're never going to be important enough to warrant a really white glove level service from your liquidity providers.
Absolutely.
So one thing you said, Subodh, that intrigued me, you talked about integration of systems and tech integration and reducing humans touching the flow, so reducing error. Looking over the horizon, do you see any further developments in this space?
Absolutely. One of the most exciting things has been the integration of payment modules into execution modules, and that will definitely continue. The challenge, of course, is that executing payments well for the LP requires obviously a global network or some kind of partnership with somebody with a global network, and that's a non-trivial problem to solve. But for most corporates, I think that should be something they should shoot for. A lot of the corporates have struggled in the past to get their payments done right. The actual physical payment can happen. What is inefficient many times is the fact that the exposures don't net correctly, or they have no way of netting them correctly. What you're looking for in a partner is somebody who can electronically net those exposures. And look, I mean, there are now banks that are working. I've spoken to somebody recently who are working on some very, very sophisticated AI-based programs, AI-based advisory that lets corporates automatically engage with this bank's module, which is an execution cum payment module, that effectively, because they can sense a pattern in how the corporate deals, learn how to advise what to do, take over their micro exposures. A lot of the corporate flows sometimes are real, individual micro exposures. There are $5,000, $10,000, $50,000 tickets that the corporate either sits and aggregates and executes in a block, or sends and hopes that the spread remains reasonable. But now banks are working on trying to automate that, where these micro exposures are handled by the system in an intelligent way, netted in an intelligent way. So there's a lot of exciting work going on that will eventually help the corporate sector. But again, it comes down to, you have to build a partnership with these banks. You have to make sure that when they go to hedge your flow, that they don't see 9 other banks lined up ahead of them, because everybody knows what that flow is. So there is a bit of give and take there.
Yeah, I think there's certainly a lot of interesting things going on in this space. I think we are running up against time, Subodh. So thank you very much for all those insights. It was a fascinating conversation.
Thank you, Tom. This was delightful.
And thank you all for staying to the end and listening to our recording.